local entities. But Republicans don't care about their economic contributions or about supporting this engine of economic growth. They're committed to a xenophobic agenda that blames immigrants for every problem in society. It's the same strategy that Vice President JD Vance used when he lied about Haitians with TPS eating people's pets. It's the same strategy that Donald Trump uses when he refers to other nations as, quote, shithole countries, end of quote. Republicans are doing this because they have no plan on affordability, on healthcare, on education, on housing or public safety, or fixing our broken immigration system. Their only plan is to blame hardworking immigrants.
You just heard it. And now we need to talk about what this actually means, because this is not just another political spat or partisan bickering, or the usual noise that fills the vacuum of cable news cycles. This is the exposure of the rotten ideological core that has metastasized within the contemporary Republican Party. And what we witnessed in that clip is a Democratic lawmaker doing what far too few have had the courage to do, which is to name the poison directly and without equivocation, and without the timid softening that has plagued liberal discourse for decades. The representative just laid bare the nakedly xenophobic architecture undergirding the entire Republican approach to immigration, and you need to understand the stakes here, because this goes far beyond the immediate controversy of whether JD Vance lied about Haitian immigrants eating pets, though he absolutely did lie, and we will get to the profound moral bankruptcy of that fabrication in a moment. But the stakes here are about the fundamental question of what kind of nation we are building, and for whom, and whether we will allow fascist scapegoating tactics to replace any semblance of policy grounded in empirical reality or human dignity. What you just witnessed is the articulation of a truth so obvious and yet so systematically obscured by both mainstream media and the cowardly centrist consensus that it bears repeating until it becomes impossible to ignore, which is that the Republican Party has abandoned any pretense of governance in favor of pure reactionary theatrics designed to channel economic anxiety and legitimate grievances about inequality and stagnant wages and healthcare costs and housing affordability into racialized hatred directed at the most vulnerable populations within our society. This is not hyperbole, and this is not partisan exaggeration, and this is not the kind of both sides false equivalence that has poisoned our political discourse for generations. This is the documented strategy that we have seen deployed again and again throughout history whenever ruling classes seek to maintain power in the face of popular discontent. And it is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, which is to find a scapegoat, and to blame that scapegoat for every social ill, regardless of whether that scapegoat has any causal relationship to the problem at hand. The representative mentioned JD Vance and his utterly fabricated claims about Haitian immigrants with temporary protected status eating people's pets in Springfield, Ohio, and we need to sit with the sheer audacity of this lie, because it represents something far more sinister than your typical political exaggeration or spin. This was a deliberate effort to dehumanize an entire community by invoking one of the most ancient and pernicious racist tropes in the xenophobic playbook, which is the image of the foreign other as barbaric and uncivilized and fundamentally incompatible with the norms of decent society. The eating of pets narrative is designed to trigger visceral disgust and to position immigrants not as human beings with complex lives and aspirations and economic contributions, but as savage threats to the social order. And this is the exact same rhetorical strategy that was used against Jewish communities in medieval Europe, with blood libel accusations, and against Chinese immigrants in 19th century America, with similar fabrications about dietary barbarism, and against every marginalized group that has ever posed a threat to the established hierarchy, simply by existing and demanding recognition. What makes this particularly grotesque is that it is verifiably false, and was debunked almost immediately by local officials in Springfield, who confirmed that there were no credible reports of Haitian immigrants eating pets, and yet JD Vance, who is now the Vice President of the United States of America, continued to amplify this lie because the truth was never the point, and the point was always to create a narrative that would justify further cruelty and further marginalization and further violence against immigrant communities. The cruelty is the point, as Adam Serwer so eloquently articulated, and the lie is the weapon, and the weapon is wielded with precision against those who lack the institutional power to effectively defend themselves, and this is how fascism operates in its nascent stages before the death camps, and before the mass deportations. There is the slow process of dehumanization that makes those atrocities thinkable, and then inevitable. And then the representative invoked Trump's infamous characterization of Haiti and El Salvador and African nations as shithole countries, And this too demands our sustained attention, because it was not an off-the-cuff remark or a slip of the tongue, but rather an authentic expression of Trump's worldview, which is rooted in white supremacist notions of civilizational hierarchy, where some nations and by extension some people are inherently valuable and others are inherently disposable. This is the logic that animated European colonialism and American imperialism and every genocidal project in human history, and it is now the explicit governing philosophy of one of America's two major political parties, and we cannot afford to normalize this or to treat it as just another difference of opinion in the marketplace of ideas, because there are some ideas that do not deserve a seat at the table and white supremacy is one of them. The representative made a crucial connection that we need to amplify, which is that Republicans engage in this xenophobic scapegoating precisely because they have no substantive policy agenda to address the material conditions that are causing suffering for working people across this country. They have no plan for affordable housing because their economic ideology is fundamentally committed to the sanctity of property rights and market mechanisms that inevitably concentrate wealth upward and leave working families competing for an ever-shrinking supply of affordable units. They have no plan for healthcare because they are beholden to pharmaceutical companies and insurance conglomerates whose business model depends on denying care and maximizing profit extraction from human suffering. They have no plan for education because they fundamentally do not believe in public goods and would prefer a system where quality education is reserved for those who can afford private schools, while everyone else is left with underfunded institutions that serve primarily as pipelines to low-wage labor or incarceration. They have no plan for public safety that does not involve further militarizing police forces and criminalizing poverty and mental illness, because their conception of order is predicated on the maintenance of existing hierarchies rather than the creation of conditions where all people can flourish. And so, in the absence of any coherent policy vision that might actually improve people's lives, Republicans retreat to the politics of resentment and division, and they do this because it works. And it works because human psychology is wired to respond more readily to threats than to complex policy analysis, and because decades of neoliberal economic restructuring have left working people with legitimate grievances that demand explanation and resolution. When your wages have stagnated for 40 years while productivity has soared, and when your housing costs have tripled while your income has remained flat, and when your student debt is crushing you, and when your medical bills are bankrupting you, and when your children face a future of precarity and climate catastrophe, then you rightfully ask what the hell went wrong, and who is responsible, and the honest answer is complicated, involves examining the structures of capitalism and the bipartisan consensus around deregulation and financialization, and the erosion of labor power, and the capture of democratic institutions by corporate interests. But that answer requires sustained analysis and political education and coalition building across lines of difference. The dishonest answer is simple and emotionally satisfying and immediately accessible, which is that immigrants are taking your jobs, and immigrants are draining public resources, and immigrants are bringing crime, and immigrants are the reason you cannot get ahead, and this answer has the advantage of requiring no structural change, and no confrontation with power, and no examination of the ways that capital has waged war against labor for generations. This answer allows working-class white Americans to maintain their position in the racial hierarchy, even as their material conditions deteriorate, because at least they are not immigrants, at least they are not the ones being scapegoated, at least they still have some group to look down upon, and this is the psychological wage of whiteness that W.E.B. Du Bois identified over a century ago, and it remains the most effective tool for preventing cross-racial working-class solidarity that might actually challenge the power of elites. But here is what the representative understands and what we need to shout from every platform available, which is that immigrants are not draining the economy, but rather sustaining it, and this is demonstrably true across every metric you could possibly examine. Immigrants are disproportionately likely to start businesses which create jobs and generate economic activity and tax revenue. Immigrants are essential workers in agriculture and meatpacking and healthcare, and construction and hospitality, and all the sectors that keep society functioning and that became impossible to ignore during the pandemic, when we suddenly recognized that the people we had been demonizing as illegals were actually the ones ensuring we had food on our tables and care in our hospitals. Immigrants pay billions of dollars in taxes, including undocumented immigrants who pay into Social Security and Medicare systems they will never be able to access themselves, which means they are literally subsidizing the retirements of the same people who want them deported. Immigrants revitalize declining communities and fill labor shortages and contribute to innovation at rates far exceeding their proportion of the population, and study after study confirms that immigration has negligible negative effects on native-born wages, except in very specific circumstances, while generating substantial aggregate benefits for the economy. These are facts, and they are not in dispute among anyone who actually examines the empirical evidence, but facts do not matter in the discourse we are navigating, because the Republican Party has fully embraced a post-truth politics, where feeling trump data, and where anecdotes supersede research, and where the repetition of lies through social media and right-wing propaganda networks creates an alternative reality that is impervious to correction. This is the epistemological crisis that Umberto Eco warned about when he said that social media gave a voice to legions of idiots who previously were limited in their ability to spread their ignorance. But now it is not just ignorance we are dealing with, but rather the deliberate weaponization of misinformation by sophisticated political operatives who understand that controlling the narrative is more important than being tethered to truth. And we need to understand that this assault on immigrants that the representative is calling out is fundamentally an assault on the principle of solidarity itself, because if we can be convinced that our interests are opposed to the interests of immigrants, then we can be prevented from recognizing that our interests are actually aligned against the interests of the billionaire class that is extracting wealth from all of us regardless of documentation status. The same corporations that exploit undocumented workers by paying sub-minimum wages and denying benefits and threatening deportation if workers try to organize are also exploiting native-born workers through wage theft and union busting and the erosion of workplace protections and the gig economy model that treats labor as a disposable commodity. The same financial institutions that redline immigrant neighborhoods and charge predatory interest rates on remittances are also engaging in foreclosure fraud and payday lending schemes that devastate working-class communities of all backgrounds. The same politicians who rail against immigrators are also the ones voting to gut Medicaid and to privatize Social Security and to eliminate the estate tax and to give massive subsidies to fossil fuel companies while infrastructure crumbles and schools close and communities are left to fend for themselves. This is class warfare, and it is being waged from above, and the scapegoating of immigrants is a crucial weapon in that warfare because it prevents the formation of the multiracial working-class coalition that would be necessary to challenge capital's dominance over our political and economic systems. This is why the representative's framing is so powerful and so necessary, because it connects the dots between the lies about pet-eating Haitians and the broader absence of any Republican policy agenda that might actually address affordability or healthcare or education or housing, and it revealed that these are not separate issues, but rather two sides of the same coin, where xenophobic distraction enables economic exploitation. Let us also examine the specific case of Haitian immigrants with temporary protected status, because their presence in communities like Springfield, Ohio, is not some accident or invasion, but rather the result of very specific policy decisions and historical relationships that the United States has with Haiti. Haiti has been systematically impoverished and destabilized by centuries of French colonial extraction, followed by American military occupation and economic interference and support for dictatorships, and the imposition of structural adjustment programs that gutted local agriculture and manufacturing in favor of sweatshop assembly plants serving American corporations. The United States has a direct hand in creating the conditions that force Haitians to migrate, and then we have the audacity to demonize them for seeking safety and opportunity in the very nation that contributed to their displacement. And this is the pattern we see repeated across the global South, where American foreign policy creates refugees, and then American domestic policy treats those refugees as invaders, rather than as people whose presence here is directly linked to our government's actions abroad. Temporary protected status is itself a deeply inadequate framework, because it treats the symptoms rather than the causes, and it leaves people in a state of permanent precarity, where their status can be revoked at any moment, depending on the whims of whatever administration is in power, and this is by design, because the point is never to actually resolve immigration status or to create pathways to citizenship, but rather to maintain a population of workers who can be exploited precisely because of their vulnerability and who can be scapegoated whenever politically convenient. The representative is right to defend TPS holders against Vance's lies, but we also need to push further and demand not just temporary protection, but permanent status, and a complete reimagining of how we understand borders and citizenship, and belonging in a world where climate change and economic dislocation and political violence are going to create hundreds of millions of displaced people in the coming decades. The invocation of Trump's shithole countries comment is also instructive, because it crystallizes the white supremacist logic that animates so much of conservative immigration discourse, even when it is couched in seemingly race-neutral language about law and order and border security and national sovereignty. When Trump asks why we are accepting immigrants from shithole countries instead of places like Norway, he is making explicit what is usually implicit, which is that immigration policy is not really about numbers or procedures or economic impacts, but rather about maintaining the racial composition of the nation in a way that privileges whiteness. This is the same logic that animated the Immigration Act of 1924, which established national origin quotas designed to preserve America's Anglo-Saxon character by restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and essentially banning immigration from Asia, and this is the same logic that informed the Chinese Exclusion Act and the internment of Japanese Americans and every other moment in our history when immigration policy has been weaponized to enforce racial hierarchy. What makes the current moment particularly dangerous is that this white supremacist logic is no longer confined to the fringes, but has been fully embraced by the mainstream of the Republican Party and by a vice president who should theoretically be more careful about trafficking in racist conspiracy theories, but instead doubles down because he understands that his base rewards this kind of transgression, and that the media environment is so fractured that he will never face real accountability from the constituencies that matter to his political survival. We are living through a moment of democratic backsliding, where norms that once constrained the expression of overtly racist ideas have been systematically dismantled, and where the guardrails that might have prevented someone like Trump or Vance from ascending to power have proven utterly inadequate, and this should terrify anyone who cares about the future of multiracial democracy in America. The representative's argument that Republicans have no plan on affordability or healthcare or education or housing is borne out by examining actual policy proposals, or rather the lack thereof. The Republican agenda, when it is articulated beyond vague platitudes about freedom and small government, consists primarily of tax cuts for the wealthy, and deregulation, and the privatization of public goods, and the erosion of the social safety net, and none of this addresses the material concerns of working people who are struggling to afford rent and groceries and childcare. When Republicans talk about healthcare, their solution is to repeal the Affordable Care Act without any coherent replacement, and to allow insurance companies to once again deny coverage for pre-existing conditions, and to gut Medicaid, which would leave millions without access to care. When Republicans talk about education, their solution is to funnel public money into private schools through voucher schemes that would further segregate and stratify an already deeply unequal system. When Republicans talk about housing, their solution is to eliminate regulations and cut funding for public housing and let the market work its magic, which has resulted in a speculative feeding frenzy where homes are treated as investment vehicles rather than as human necessities, and where entire neighborhoods are bought up by private equity firms and converted into rental properties with skyrocketing prices. None of this is policy in any meaningful sense of the word, and none of it would improve the lives of the working people who constitute the Republican base, but it serves the interests of the donor class that funds Republican campaigns, and that is ultimately who they govern for, regardless of the populist rhetoric they deploy during election cycles. The culture war issues like immigration and trans rights and critical race theory are useful precisely because they mobilize voters emotionally while allowing Republicans to avoid any substantive discussion of economic policy that might require them to acknowledge that their agenda is fundamentally about upward redistribution of wealth and the consolidation of power in the hands of corporate elites. This is why the representative's framing that the assault on immigrants is fundamentally an assault on something larger is so crucial, and we need to complete that thought which was cut off in the clip, but which points toward the recognition that attacking immigrants is an assault on the principle of solidarity and on the possibility of building a society based on mutual care rather than competition and domination. Every time we allow immigrants to be scapegoated, we are reinforcing the logic that some people are deserving and others are not, and that our compassion and our resources are
finite and must be rationed according to some hierarchy of worthiness, and this logic is ultimately the same logic that justifies every form of oppression and exclusion, whether based on race or class, or gender or sexuality or disability or documentation status. The alternative vision which the representative is gesturing toward and which we need to articulate more fully is one where we recognize our interdependence and where we understand that the flourishing of immigrant communities is not in tension with but rather essential to the flourishing of all communities. This means not just defending immigrants against lies and attacks but actively fighting for policies that would provide pathways to citizenship and labor protections and access to social services, and the dismantling of the deportation apparatus that terrorizes millions of people living in this country. This means connecting the fight for immigrant rights to the fight for universal healthcare and housing as a human right and free college and a Green New Deal, and all the other elements of a progressive agenda that would actually address the root causes of economic insecurity rather than channeling that insecurity into racist backlash.
And we need to be honest about the fact that Democrats have often been complicit in the rightward drift on immigration policy, and have adopted Republican framing about border security, and have supported detention and deportation, and have failed to use moments of power to pass comprehensive reform. And this is part of why Republicans have been able to dominate the discourse, because Democrats have too often conceded the premise that immigration is primarily a security threat, rather than an economic and humanitarian opportunity. The representatives' willingness to call out Republican lies and xenophobia is commendable and necessary, but it also needs to be accompanied by an affirmative vision of what pro-immigrant policy would actually look like, and a willingness to fight for that vision, even when it is politically inconvenient or when it requires confronting restrictionist sentiment within Democratic coalitions. What we are seeing play out in clips like this one is the battle for the soul of the nation, to use a phrase that has become almost cliché, but that captures something real about the stakes involved, because we are at a crossroads where we can either recommit to the principles of pluralism and democracy and human dignity, or we can continue down the path of authoritarian nationalism that treats difference as threat and that concentrates power in the hands of a white Christian minority that sees demographic change as existential danger. The rising tide of xenophobia that Vance and Trump represent is not some aberration or deviation from American values, but rather the resurgence of a deeply rooted nativist tradition that has always existed alongside and in tension with more expansive visions of who gets to be American and who deserves protection and care. This nativist tradition has taken different forms throughout our history, from the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s to the Immigration Restriction League at the turn of the 20th century, to the America First movement before World War II, and in each iteration it has deployed similar rhetorical strategies about protecting American workers and preserving American culture and maintaining law and order, and in each iteration these ostensibly neutral concerns have been revealed as proxies for racial and religious animus. The contemporary version represented by Trump and Vance is in many ways more sophisticated because it has learned to code its racism in language about border security and rule of law and protecting American sovereignty, but the underlying logic remains unchanged, which is that America belongs to a particular kind of people, and everyone else is here on sufferance and can be expelled or excluded whenever convenient. The lies about Haitian immigrants eating pets are particularly revealing, because they demonstrate that no amount of legal status or economic contribution or community integration will protect immigrant communities from being targeted when it becomes politically useful to do so. The Haitians in Springfield have temporary protected status, which means they are here legally, and they have been documented as contributing to the local economy and revitalizing a community that had been in decline, and yet none of that mattered when Vance needed a villain for his campaign narrative. This should make clear that the issue is not really about legal versus illegal immigration, or about following proper procedures, or about any of the other ostensibly neutral criteria that immigration restrictionists claim to care about, but rather about the fundamental question of whether we are willing to accept immigrants as full members of our society, regardless of their origin or their documentation status. The clip we just watched represents a small but significant act of resistance to the xenophobic consensus that Republicans are trying to impose, and it matters that a Democratic elected official is willing to use strong language like xenophobic agenda, and to directly accuse the vice president of lying and to connect these attacks on immigrants to the broader failure of Republican governance. This is the kind of moral clarity that has been too often absent from Democratic messaging, which has tended toward tepid both-sidesism, and which has been afraid of being labeled as radical or extreme, or out of touch with working-class concerns. But what the representative understands is that working-class concerns are not opposed to immigrant rights, but are rather inextricably linked because the same forces that are exploiting immigrant labor are also exploiting native-born labor, and the same policies that would protect immigrants would also protect all workers. We need more Democrats willing to make this case forcefully and repeatedly, and to reject the premise that there is some inherent trade-off between supporting immigrants and supporting workers, because that premise is false and is promoted by those who benefit from a divided working class. We need Democrats willing to talk about the ways that immigration enforcement has become a mechanism for labor control and wage suppression, and for terrorizing entire communities and disrupting organizing efforts, and we need Democrats willing to propose not just incremental reforms, but transformative changes to how we understand borders and citizenship in the 21st century. The emotional register of the clip is significant, because it conveys genuine outrage at the lies and the scapegoating, and this outrage is appropriate and necessary because we should be outraged when public officials deliberately spread false information designed to dehumanize vulnerable communities. We should be outraged when the Vice President of the United States amplifies racist conspiracy theories about immigrants eating pets. We should be outraged when the president refers to entire nations as shitholes, and when immigration policy is conducted through the separation of families and the detention of children, and the deportation of people who have lived here for decades, and who have American citizen children, and who are deeply embedded in their communities. This outrage needs to be channeled into political action and organizing and movement building, because moral condemnation alone will not stop the rise of fascist politics, but it is a necessary starting point because it establishes that these things are not normal and not acceptable, and not just another policy disagreement between two equally valid perspectives. There is no valid perspective that justifies lying about immigrants eating pets, and there is no valid perspective that justifies characterizing entire nations as shitholes, and there is no valid perspective that treats human beings as invasive species that need to be removed for the health of the body politic, and we need to stop pretending that there is in the name of civility, or bipartisanship, or reaching across the aisle. The stakes of this moment cannot be overstated, because we are watching in real time as one of America's two major parties completes its transformation into an explicitly authoritarian formation that rejects democratic norms and embraces political violence and traffics in racist conspiracy theories and proposes mass deportation as a central policy agenda, and all of this is happening not on the margins, but in the mainstream, with the full support of conservative media and religious institutions and business interests that see authoritarian nationalism as preferable to any genuine redistribution of power or wealth. The lies about immigrants are not incidental to this project, but central to it, because they provide the justification for the expansion of state violence and the normalization of cruelty and the erosion of civil liberties that will ultimately be used not just against immigrants, but against anyone who dissents or who belongs to a marginalized community or who threatens the interests of the ruling class. This is why defending immigrants is defending everyone, and why the representative is correct to frame this as an assault on something larger than just immigration policy, because once we accept that the state can round up and deport millions of people based on their documentation status, then we have accepted the premise that human rights are conditional, and that the state has unlimited power to determine who belongs and who does not, and this premise can and will be extended to other populations. We have already seen this in the ways that immigration enforcement infrastructure has been used, against black and brown citizens and against political protesters, and in the ways that the rhetoric about border security bleeds into rhetoric about crime and terrorism and national security threats that justify ever-expanding surveillance and policing powers. The fight over immigration, therefore, not a single issue but rather a site where all of our values and commitments are tested, and where we demonstrate whether we actually believe in the principles we claim to hold about human dignity and due process and the right to seek asylum and the possibility of building multiracial democracy. The representative who delivered these remarks understands this and is trying to raise the alarm about the Republican strategy of blame and distraction, and we need to amplify this message and build on it and connect it to the broader project of constructing a left populism that can actually address people's material needs while rejecting the siren call of scapegoating and division. What would that left populism look like in practice? And how do we build it? And these are the questions that should animate our organizing and our advocacy and our electoral strategies going forward, because it is not enough to simply oppose Republican xenophobia. We also need to offer a compelling alternative vision that addresses why people are struggling and who is responsible and what we can do about it. That vision needs to include Medicare for all, so that healthcare is treated as a human right rather than as a commodity to be rationed based on ability to pay, and it needs to include housing as a human right with massive public investment in social housing and strict regulations on speculation and rent control, and it needs to include free college and the cancellation of student debt, and universal childcare and paid family leave, and a Green New Deal that creates millions of good union jobs while transitioning away from fossil fuels, and it needs to include labor law reform that makes it easier to organize unions and that increases the minimum wage to a living wage and that cracks down on wage theft and misclassification. All of these policies would materially improve people's lives and would address the actual root causes of economic anxiety rather than channeling that anxiety into racist backlash, and all of these policies would benefit immigrants and native-born workers alike because they are based on universal programs that strengthen the social safety net and reduce competition for scarce resources. This is how we build solidarity across difference, and this is how we counter the Republican strategy of division, and this is how we create the conditions for transformative change that would actually challenge the power of capital rather than simply rearranging which groups of workers are pitted against each other. The clip we watched is a small glimpse of what this kind of politics could sound like when Democrats are willing to speak with moral clarity and to name the Republican agenda for what it is, and to refuse the framework that treats xenophobia as a legitimate political position worthy of debate and consideration. We need more of this, and we need it to be connected to an affirmative policy agenda, and we need it to be backed up by concrete organizing that builds power in communities and workplaces, and that creates the political conditions for passing transformative legislation, even in the face of entrenched opposition from corporate interests and the right-wing media apparatus. The lies that Vance told about Haitian immigrants were not just offensive or inaccurate, they were dangerous because they incited threats and violence against the Haitian community in Springfield, and because they contributed to a climate of fear and intimidation that affects all immigrant communities regardless of their specific circumstances. And this is the point, which is that the cruelty and the lies are not bugs but features of the Republican approach, because they serve to terrorize and to silence and to prevent people from speaking up or organizing or demanding their rights. When immigrants live in fear of deportation or violence, they are less likely to report labor violations or to join unions or to participate in civic life, and this benefits employers who want a docile and exploitable workforce, and it benefits politicians who want to maintain power by restricting who gets to vote and who gets to be counted as a full member of the political community. This is social control through fear, and it is one of the oldest and most effective tools of authoritarian governance, and we are seeing it, deployed systematically across multiple fronts, from immigration enforcement, to abortion bans, to trans bathroom bills, to book bans, to the criminalization of protest, and all of these are part of the same project of restricting freedom and concentrating power and enforcing hierarchies of gender, race and sexuality, and citizenship status. The fight for immigrant rights is therefore inseparable from the fight for reproductive justice and trans liberation, and Black lives and workers' rights, and all the other struggles that constitute the broader movement for social justice and human dignity. The representative's comments point us toward this intersectional understanding, even if they do not fully articulate it, and our job is to build on this foundation, and to make the connections explicit, and to organize across these different constituencies in ways that recognize our common interest in dismantling systems of oppression and building new systems based on care and solidarity and mutual aid. This is not easy work, and it requires confronting the ways that oppression operates differently for different groups, and the ways that some of us benefit from certain hierarchies even as we are harmed by others, and it requires a commitment to following the leadership of those most directly affected, and to building multiracial and cross-class coalitions that can sustain themselves through inevitable setbacks and defeats. But this work is necessary and urgent, because the alternative is the continued rise of authoritarian nationalism and the further entrenchment of oligarchic power and the acceleration of climate catastrophe and the normalization of cruelty as public policy, and we cannot afford to be complacent or to imagine that things will somehow work themselves out, or that the arc of history bends toward justice without our active intervention. Justice is not inevitable, it is something we have to fight for every single day, and that fight begins with refusing the lies and the scapegoating and the division that people like Trump and Vance are selling, and it continues with building the alternative vision and the political power necessary to make that vision real. The clip we just watched is a call to arms disguised as a parliamentary speech, and we need to hear it as such, and to respond accordingly, because every moment we spend debating whether immigrants are good or bad for the economy, or whether they deserve compassion, or whether we can afford to help them, is a moment we are not spending organizing to transform the systems that create scarcity and insecurity in the first place. The question is not whether we can afford to support immigrants, the question is why we live in the richest country in human history, and yet millions of people, both immigrant and native-born, lack access to healthcare and housing and education, and dignified work, and the answer to that question is that our resources have been systematically extracted and hoarded by a tiny elite who use their wealth to purchase political power and to shape policy in their interests, and who fund the politicians and the media outlets and the think tanks that promote xenophobia, as a way of preventing us from asking why Jeff Bezos has $200 billion while teachers are buying their own school supplies, and why we spend more on military contractors than on addressing homelessness. These are the questions that the Republican Party desperately wants us not to ask, and these are the questions that the Democratic establishment has too often been unwilling to ask, because they too are beholden to corporate donors, and because they too have accepted the neoliberal framework that treats markets as natural and inevitable, rather than as political constructions that can and should be democratically governed. The representative in this clip is pushing against that framework, even if gently, and is trying to redirect our attention toward the real sources of our problems, and toward the recognition that we have far more in common with immigrants than we do with the billionaires who are robbing us all. This message needs to be repeated and amplified until it becomes common sense, and until it reshapes our political discourse in ways that make xenophobic scapegoating politically untenable, and that create space for genuinely transformative policy that would address the root causes of inequality, insecurity. We are not there yet, and we have a long way to go, but clips like this one represent small victories in the larger struggle for narrative control and political consciousness, and we should celebrate them while also recognizing that they are only meaningful if they inspire us to action and organization, and sustained commitment to the work of building a better world. The lies about pet-eating Haitians will be forgotten soon enough, and will be replaced by new lies about new targets, because that is how the propaganda machine operates, with an endless stream of manufactured outrages designed to keep us angry and divided and distracted, but the underlying dynamics will remain the same until we change them, and that requires more than just debunking individual lies or calling out individual politicians. It requires building movements powerful enough to transform the structural conditions that make scapegoating politically effective in the first place. It requires creating material abundance and security so that people do not feel like they are competing for scraps, and so that solidarity becomes rational self-interest rather than abstract moral commitment. This is the work ahead of us, and it is daunting but not impossible, and there are millions of people across this country and around the world who are engaged in this work every day through mutual aid networks and tenant organizing and labor unions and immigrant rights organizations and climate justice movements and abolitionist organizing and all the other forms of grassroots resistance and alternative institution building that are creating the foundations for the world we want to live in. The representative's comments in this clip are a reminder that we also need people inside the institutions of government who are willing to use their platforms to tell the truth and to call out lies and to advocate for policies that would actually help people, and we should support those people while also recognizing that electoral politics alone will never be sufficient, and that real change comes from mass movements that force elites to respond to popular demands. So let us take the outrage we feel when we watch clips like this one, and let us channel it into organizing and into showing up for our communities, and into building the world where no one has to flee their home because of violence or climate disaster or economic desperation, and where everyone who does migrate is welcomed and supported and recognized as valuable, and where we measure our society not by how much wealth we have accumulated, but by how well we care for the most vulnerable among us. This is the vision that stands in opposition to Trump and Vance and their politics of cruelty, and this is the vision we need to fight for with everything we have, because our collective future depends on it, and because we owe it to all the people who have fought before us, and to all the people who will come after us to leave behind something better than what we inherited, and because in the end, we are all immigrants on this earth, all temporary inhabitants who deserve dignity and care for however long we are here.